Now we're on the Vav Amud Beis. And what did the Brisa mean when it said that the person who brought the carbon oil and he didn't do smicha lo kiper kapishmaya? As far as the strict letter of the law, the kapara is inherent in the carbon, and a carbon without smicha is still kosher, and therefore kiper gav. But in the eyes of Shamayim, he didn't do the right thing. He omitted smicha. And now Rav Huna bar Yehuda, who offered this Tzvei Dinim, this interpretation, is now going to prove it from a Mishnah. Milo Tanan, don't we have a Mishnah in Masechta Negoim? And here we're dealing with a Metzora. Hanoser b'shemim and Hashemin al akaf lechaper olav. Right, so the din is that in order for a Metzora to become Tahar, he's got to undermine a procedure in which the shemen is placed by the Kohen on his big toe and on his thumb, and where else? What did I leave out? Help me out here. On the calf of his hand, and then the Torah says if there's leftover oil afterwards, then it's poured onto the head of the mitzorah. That's called noser b'shemim min Hashem and asher al kaf is lechaper olav lifnei Hashem. And the Mishnah says, Im nosan kiper, if the oil was placed on his head, all that extra oil, then he achieves again, the word here is kapar, but it really means tara. V'im lo nosan lo kiper. Tivri Rabbi Akiva. So lo kiper means he remains tamei. That's Rabbi Akiva. We're interested now in Rabbi Yochanan Nuri. Omer shiyori mitzvahein. No, the idea that the leftover oil is poured on his head, that's only shiyori mitzvah. The tara can be achieved even without that. Bein nitain, bein lo nitain, whether he applied the shemen to his head or he didn't. Umailin olav, however, ki'ilo kiper. What does that mean? Umaila olav ki'ilo kiper. My of kiper. Carbon achrini has to bring a second carbon to replace the first Homer ben nitan ben lo nitan kiper. So apparently he doesn't have any obligation to bring another carbon. Ela kiper gavra, but lo kiper kamishmaya. But rather it means that as far as the technical fulfillment of his obligation to achieve kapar through the carbon, that he did, but in heaven wasn't perfect. He didn't get the oil on his head. Not sure why he's guilty. Maybe the Kohen should be guilty. But anyway, Hachinami Kiper, here too, we're going to say the same thing, that if he didn't do smicha, then although he'll get a kapara, because the ola is mechaper on the gavra in a general sense, but up in Shamayim, they're not happy with him. Hosam Nami Kiper Matan Bahomnos. So Rava now rejects this understanding of the Mishnah in the Goyim, because maybe what Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri means when he says Shiori Mitzvah Hain Bein Nitan Bein Shalom Nitan Mile of a Kosav Ki'ilu Kiper Ki'ilu Lo Kiper Nitan is Kiper is Lo Kiper Matnos Harosh. In other words, he's going to have to undergo a replacement, bring another lug shemen and pour it on his head. But he's tahar. Whereas Rabbi Kiva says he's not even tahar. Again, there's a lot of discussion about that. In any event, you have no raya from here, this Mishnah, that when it says if he didn't get the oil on his head is lo kiper, that it just simply refers to, HaKadosh Baruch Hu not being so happy with him because lo kiper now has a halachic significance, namely that he has to bring another lug shemen to replace the first lug shemen, to supplement the first two lug shemen and achieve the pouring of the shemen on his head. Toshma. So now we're looking again for another proof that whether the Ola is Machaper even for violations of an essay that took place after the designation of the Korban Ola. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Kivsei Atzeres Lomein Boin. So on Shavuos, they have to bring 2 Kivsei Atzeres. No, I'm sorry. The Gemara says Kivsei Atzeres Shlomim. Rabbi Shimon had, you have to reformulate his question. I mean, there's Korban Shlomim. It's called Shalmi Atzeres, Kivsei Atzeres. I mean, Rabbi Shimon wouldn't even bother asking why do we bring Kivsei Atzeres. I mean, that's what the Torah requires. Ella, but rather what was bothering the mind of Rabbi Shimon? Se'iri Atzeres lo mein bayim. He wasn't worried about the Korban Shlomim that's brought with Kvasim, but rather he was worried about the Korban Sa'ir. And why do we bring 2 of them? Because the purpose of the Korban Sa'ir is Al Tumas Migdosh V'Kadoshav. Is therefore Nizrak Domu Shel Rishon, which achieves the Korban and removes any Tumas Migdosh V'Kadoshav by atoning for those Averis. Is Shnei Ilam Karb. Why is he bringing a second Korban? Why the Torah required a second Korban? Now the Torah requires 2 Korbanos here. But I think what the Gemara is trying to do is figure out the logic of the second Korban Sa'ir. Meaning, how could the Torah ask me to bring another Sa'ir if the first Sa'ir already achieved the goal of being mechaper on Tumas Migdash V'Kadosha? And the Gemara gives a strange answer. Why does the Torah want a second Sa'ir? And the answer is Al Tuma Sha'ora Bein Zelazet. Wow. He brought the first Sa'ir, and then he inadvertently came in contact with a dead body or a sheretz, whatever it might be. And he walked into the Mikdash without realizing it. Or he ate Kodesh, and he was Tameh, etc., etc. So if this happened between the first Karban Sa'ir and the second Sa'ir, we have to bring the second Sa'ir. And Mar Me'ata, Ru'uyim Hoy Yisrael, Lahakriv Karnosem B'chol Esu B'chol Shah, El Shechisech HaKos. Now, I think what the Bryces kind of point out is if you're worried about a second violation of Tumas Mikdash for Kadosh, we have to bring the first Sa'ir, then why don't you worry about a third violation of Tumas Mikdash Kadosh after the second Sa'ir? And the answer is that God had compassion, not to deplete the bank account of Klal Yisrael. Frekti Gemara v'hacha di ase liachar afrasha become a chapra. The Gemara is now assuming that both seirim of Atzeres, of Shavuos, are brought simultaneously. So how can you tell me that if there's going to be, right, so he's mafresh 2 seirim simultaneously, now he violates another Tumas Mikdash for Kadoshav, now he brings the seirim, now you're going to tell me the seirim are going to be mechaper for that which he did afterwards? Between one Sa'ir and the other, we're trying to figure out why you brought a second Sa'ir, but the second Sa'ir was brought simultaneously with the first Sa'ir. There's no time lapse that would allow for any violation. So Gemara answers, you're right. If they would have been mafresh both he-goats at the same exact time, then what do we need the second he-goat for? It's impossible to say that that's coming to mechaper for another violation between the first and the second Sa'ir, because there was no time lapse between the first and the second Sa'ir. But what's the case? Very strange. We're talking about a pasuk in Chumash. The Torah says you have to bring 2 seir. The pasuk is talking about a case of Hachamay Eskinen where he was mafresh bozeh zeh. And the Torah would say that if you were mafresh both seer at the same time, then the second sar is possible. In fact, the Gemara v'lema v'leiku v'lema leilikra dechik siva bozeh zeh siva. You're going to tell me that the pasuk that commands us to bring two seerim is talking about a case where he brings the sar or he's mafresh the sar at time T1. When was he mafresh the second sar? We have to assume he did it at a delay. Maybe he brought the second. He was mafresh the second sar immediately after he was mafresh the first sar. Rav Papa says karbanos sivur ka'amet. These seirim are brought on atzeres for tumas mikdash kadoshev are not individual private karbanos. It's not like, let's say, Ruvain went into the Migdash Tameh, or he ate Kodshim Vituma, and then he brings a carbon Yachid. We're not talking about a carbon Yachid, we're talking about a carbon Tzibur. Shani carbon Tzibur de Lev Bezdin Masnalim. Now we introduce a whole new concept in the world of Kodshim called Lev Bezdin Masnalim. Now, the original formulation of Lev Bezdin Masnalim in the case of a carbon tzibur is in a case of Trumas Halishka, and there was leftover money at the end of the year because every year's karbonos have to be brought from the money collected in that year. Now he left over some money from one year to the other, and that money would be used to buy a carbon ola from Keitz HaMizbeach, which we discussed at great length yesterday. Now, let's say with the monies of this year's collection of Trumas Halishka, they were able to buy, 1,000 karbonos tamid, which is a carbon ola, and they didn't need all 1,000 of them. So they have Mosar. Now, l'chora, if there's Mosar, you can't bring it this year. You're going to have to bring it next year, but you can't bring it next year because it was collected from the previous year's Trumas Halishka. So what are your options over here? You can't be poda it if it becomes a balas mum because it's kedushas haguf and there's no pigeon on kedushas haguf. Well, let's assume it's not mum. Leave out mum. So for this, we introduce a concept called Lev Bezdin Masnalin, that Bezdin reserves the right to downgrade a carbon from Kedushas Haguf to Kedushas Damim, which allow us to be poda it and bring from the pigeon money a carbon ola from the Keitz HaMizbeach. Amalei Rav Yosef Breder Rav Shmuel Rav Papa. It's a very beautiful pshat, but you're saying it to interpret Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon doesn't hold from Leiv Bezdin Masalim. How do I know that? The Omar of Idi Bar Oven Rav Amar Rav Yitzchak Tmidim Shalohutzuchul Tzibur. Right, you have a spare surplus. That's the word I want to use. You have a surplus of the Tamid for the sake of the community that you don't need this year. Here we turn to the Avzayin. The Dir of Shimon ain't niftim tmimim. You can't be poded because it has Kedush Saguf. There's no pigeon on Kedush Saguf. So therefore, Reb Shimon would only allow for pigeon if it became a balas mum. Well, the Dir Chachamim niftim tmimim. You can be poded, meaning it's not Kedush Saguf. It's only Kedush Damim. How did the Chachamim establish Kedush Damim with regard to a carbon ola? And the answer is, since the carbon ola is shel tzibur, the tzibur has, according to the Chachamim, has been empowered with what we call leiv bezdin masnal, and they can make a t'nai, and they can say that if this carbon tamid is unnecessary, then we want it to be kedushas damid rather than kedushas guf, and therefore lend itself to pigeon. But according to Reb Shimon, you can't be poded. You have the surplus tamid, you can't be poded. Why not? because it has Kedusha Guf. What happened to Leiv Beis Masalim? So you see clearly that Rav Shimon rejected Leiv Beis Masalim. Okay, then. So this is where we'll stop here on Daf Zayin. And Baruch Hashem, we got a little bit of ahead of ourselves, so for Shabbos we could rest more. Then we have 2 days Rosh Hashanah. That's going to really throw us for a loop. I don't know how to solve that problem, but okay, all the best. Have a great Shabbos. Thank you so much.